Mr. President, I am wearing this ribbon because the Orlando community is mourning once again. Last night there was another shooting. A number of people have been killed again. And today marks 2 years since the tragic massacre at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando. 2 years since a gunman walked into the club with a Sig Sauer MCX assault rifle, killed 49 innocent people. They were there celebrating Latin American night at a gay nightclub in one of the deadliest mass shootings in modern U.S. history, only to be eclipsed by the massacre a year ago in Las Vegas of 59 people, eclipsing 49 deaths. But in that carnage, a number of people severely wounded, and of those who did not actually have the physical wounds, the mental and emotional wounds that are not unlike the PTSD that our soldiers suffer and have to be treated for years and years. Well, that's true in the Orlando community as a result of the massacre at the Pulse nightclub. And so Orlando is mourning again at this 2-year mark. There were some incredible things that came out of this. I've never seen the Orlando community unite as it was, with the leadership of the entire community, regardless of their politics, wearing these kind of ribbons to point out the unity and the phrase, Orlando Strong. And today is a day to pause and to honor the victims and the survivors, and to once again to thank the first responders who put their lives on the line to save so many more. Law enforcement was magnificent. The SWAT team was magnificent. I talked to the SWAT team. There was one of the SWAT members that actually had stitches across his forehead, and but 4 millimeters, he would have been dead. And that was one of the rounds from the assault rifle. I talked to the trauma team at the Orlando Regional Hospital. A trauma unit just so happened about 10 or 15 blocks from the Pulse nightclub. And but for that trauma unit, those trauma surgeons, and to see their courage in trying to get victims stabilized, but for them, there would have been more deaths. And this is a day to look back on what we've actually done to prevent another such tragedy from ever happening again. And unfortunately, not much has happened until a bold, very courageous group of students, after the massacre in Parkland, Florida at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School, until they stood up and said, we're going to make a difference. Well, Orlando community is once again mourning today because last night a gunman shot a police officer and then killed 4 young innocent children that he was holding hostage in an apartment. So it's happened again. And these children, all under the age of 12, and one was just a year old, were killed by a man who, like so many others, shouldn't have had a gun in the first place. And so when are we going to say enough is enough? At some point, Congress has to accept the fact that the only way to change the current path is that we as a society are going to have to take a step in the right direction to do the right thing. And yet, you can remember a couple years ago, we tried in this body to pass a bill that said that if you were on the terrorist watch list, that it was going to be the law of the land that you could not buy a gun. Now, mind you, the terrorist watch list, we think they are potentially a terrorist, and therefore they cannot get on an airplane and fly on a commercial airliner. But we could not pass that to say that you could not buy or acquire a gun. And so what we see that destroys our communities, we're going to have to do more than just increasing security at schools and in some wrong-headed attempts to arm teachers. First of all, the teachers don't want to be armed in schools. And I'll tell you who else doesn't want them to be armed is the SWAT team that has to storm the school building looking for the shooter. And then they come upon a teacher with a gun and think that's the shooter. So more than just increasing funding for mental health or expanding background checks, which we desperately have to do, universal comprehensive background checks that would pick up red flags, that would pick up the red flags about mental health, like the Parkland shooter. More than just raising the minimum age to buy a gun or banning the sale of bump stocks, which make a semi-automatic assault rifle into an automatic, a true military weapon. At some point, Congress has got to start standing up for the people it represents. It's got to turn a deaf ear to the special interest that lock down their votes here because they want to sell more guns. At some point, Congress has to stand up to the NRA, which represents the gun manufacturers, not the target shooters, not the hunters. It represents the gun manufacturers to sell more guns. I say this as a fella who grew up on a ranch, having guns all my life, having hunted all my life. I still hunt with my son. But an assault rifle like an AR-15 is not for hunting, it's for killing. And we've got to face the fact of banning the sale of the military assault rifle types and the long clips of some 30 rounds of ammunition. The attack at Pulse nightclub 2 years ago was an attack of both terror and hate. And it was an attack on our fundamental American values of dignity and equality. It was an attack designed to divide us as a nation. But what we saw instead was an entire community, an entire country come together united. And in the remembrance of the victims today in Orlando, you will see this ribbon worn by many, many citizens in the community. And on the 2-year date of that horrific event. I want us to come together again in the same way we did after Pulse in Orlando, the same way that we did after Parkland, but this time, not to help each other just mourn to get through the tragedy, but to require real change to make sure that it's going to be more difficult for this to happen again. Aren't people beginning to realize that there's way too much gun violence in this country? And a lot of it ever since Sandy Hook Elementary School in Connecticut. Just in my state of Florida, just this year, we've seen 17 students gunned down at Marjory Stoneman Douglas. Just in this year, 1 month after that, we saw another student shot at Forest High School in Ocala. And just last month, a sheriff's deputy was shot and killed in Lake Placid. And then this week, we wake to the news of an officer shot in Orlando and the deaths of 4 young children who were held hostage. We should not allow these shootings to become the new normal in this country. This senator has been involved in a lot of bipartisan bills to prohibit known or suspected terrorists from purchasing firearms, to empower family members and law enforcement to take guns away from relatives who pose a danger to themselves and others who bring up these so-called red flags. These are sensible, bipartisan options to help make our communities safer. And yet, there has been little movement in the Senate to proceed on these proposals. The student leaders of our March for Our Lives organization, they've said it. The parents of the children at Sandy Hook have said it. Those who have lost loved ones to suicide have said it. 2 years after Pulse, our resolve to end gun violence must be stronger than ever. It's time for us to act, and yet we realize the practical politics that it's going to be very, very difficult to move legislation. But we have to keep trying. So let's work on some real bipartisan common sense solutions to make our communities safer. Let's work on how we can prevent these assault weapons from getting into the wrong hands. Let's work together on how we can stop massacres that continue to plague this country. We owe it to the victims of the massacre and their families. We owe it to every American who has the right to live without fear of this violence. Just ask the students in the schools of America today if they fear that violence. Really, isn't enough enough? Mr. President, I yield the floor.